So where exactly did the Jews come from? Well, there are many theories on the matter, so let's start with the one you're probably most familiar with. The story begins with the biblical patriarch Abraham, who came from the city of Ur. We don't know exactly where Ur was, but most archaeologists believe it was somewhere in Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq. Abraham was spoken to by God, who told him that he had a promised land for him out west in the land of Canaan. God made a covenant with Abraham, promising him that he would be the father of many nations. But Abraham, along with his wife Sarah, were very old, and so they didn't quite buy into God's promise of children. So Sarah tried to fulfill the promise on her own with her slave or servant, depending on translation, Hagar. And with Hagar, he had his first son, Ishmael. However, he eventually would have a son with his wife Sarah, who would be named Isaac. And these two parts of his family did not get along. There was a lot of tension. The two sons would have to compete for their father's inheritance. Well, Sarah wasn't having any of that, and so she demanded that Abraham kick Hagar and Ishmael out of their tribe, group, or whatever they were calling it, and God acquiesced to this. And so the two of them were banished. Ishmael and Hagar go into the wilderness, which many believe to be somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula, making Ishmael the father of the Arab peoples. And after being nearly sacrificed by Abraham, Isaac would go on to have his own son Jacob, whom God renamed Israel. Jacob would have 12 sons, who would become the progenitors of the 12 tribes of Israel. One of the sons, Joseph, was Jacob's favorite, and so he got a snazzy coat, and all of his brothers were jealous. So they stole his coat, sold him into slavery into Egypt, and told their father that he was killed. As a slave in Egypt, Joseph worked until he became second in command. At this point, his brothers had had to flee the land of Canaan from a famine and to find food in Egypt. After some tricks and tough love, Joseph revealed to his brothers that he had been alive the whole time. He invited his family to live with him in Egypt, which is where the story of Exodus picks up. But that's beyond the scope of this episode. So what does our friend Josephus have to say about this event? Yeah, so most historians have a hard time taking the Old Testament at face value as a historical source. But contrary to popular opinion, it's not because it has supernatural explanations for events. The Jews are far from the only people having those. What makes it difficult is that there aren't any corroborating sources agreeing with what the Jews say. Basically, no one from the time period in which Abraham lived mentioned him existing. On the one hand, this critique could simply be written off as, that's a long time ago, and it's not likely other people would have heard of him, or if they had, they wouldn't have thought he was important at all. After all, he was just some guy who left his home city in Mesopotamia and settled somewhere else. Why take any note of him? On the other hand, we could ask ourselves, if Abraham became so important later on, why then didn't other peoples try to incorporate him into their own national narratives later? The biggest problem with historical origin stories like this is that they rely on the historicity of individuals from time periods where there isn't much historical evidence for anyone living at the time. You have similar issues with the founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus. Ultimately, the story of Abraham and the other patriarchs are non-falsifiable. You can't really prove it, but you can't disprove it either, so we're kind of stuck on that front. But what about other explanations for their origins? Well, there are a few theories. One method is the linguistic approach. This is an attempt to trace the origins of a people by looking at their language and finding common roots with other languages. For centuries, Christian writers recognized similarities between Hebrew, Arabic, Phoenician, and other Near Eastern languages. It wasn't until the late 18th century that European scholars actually created a classification for these languages, for which the German scholar Ludwig von Scholz coined the term Semitic, which is derived from the name Shem, who is the son of Noah from whom the Bible says Abraham is descended. As the Europeans began to get more involved in the Near East, they uncovered more and more similarities between Hebrew and other regional languages. In the latter half of the 19th century, the works of linguists and archaeologists uncovered and translated a set of letters called the Armana letters, which refer to a group of people as the Habiru. Now, you don't have to be a linguist to notice that the names Habiru and Hebrew sound very similar, and many scholars at the time believed that they had found the origin of the Jews this way. The Amarna letters were a series of diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptians and subordinate Canaanite kings. In these letters, they complained about a group of people called the Habaru. The Habaru were described as nomadic outsiders who attacked and robbed cities. Most of the letters were from Canaanite kings asking the Egyptians to help defend themselves against the outsiders. These letters were dated to sometime between the 15th and 13th centuries BCE, which many historians and archaeologists believe may have been the time period in which the Israelites conquered the land of Canaan. These connections became the basis for the Habaru Hebrew theory, but it doesn't come without its problems. First of all, in the letters, the Habaru are not described as an ethnic or religious group, but rather as more of a social class, a group of people who refuse to subordinate themselves to local rulers. Some have argued that this could mean that the Hebrews originated not as an ethnic group, but rather as a discriminated social class. However, this becomes a little more difficult to justify when you see the term Habaru was used in more than just Canaan. There were Habaru all over the Near East, which makes it a little harder for a single group of people to have claimed the title for themselves. There's also the assumption being made that Habaru and Hebrew must be related because they sound similar. Now, I personally am not too knowledgeable about linguistics, but people who are far more knowledgeable than me have said that this very likely could be a case of false cognates, or two words that sound similar but have completely different origins. The history of the Habaru Hebrew theory is also somewhat problematic, because you see, around the same time this theory was being developed, in neighboring fields, they were also developing the Aryan Theory. And in case you're curious, yes, I'm referring to the Aryan theory that became the basis for Nazi race ideology. Linguists in the 19th century believed that the language of a people reflects the nature of their people. The ancient Aryan language was seen as powerful and dynamic, while Semitic languages were seen as conservative and against change. These 19th century linguists and ethnographers believed that the peoples of Europe are descended from a group of Central Asian Aryans, from whom the Europeans inherited their ability to dominate the world. The description of the Habaru as nomads who stole from people and refused to conform to norms of local peoples also played into many stereotypes of Jewish people that the Europeans had had for centuries. The Jews were portrayed as landless people who were destined to be nomads forever. They also saw the Habaru affinity for pillaging as the behavioral origin for Jewish moneylending. However, any competent historian will tell you that this was a profession forced on Jews by European Christians. The scholars from these two theories built their ideas on much of the research from the other. The Aryan theory was discredited by the Nazis in World War II, but the Habaru Hebrew theory has retained some of its clout because it wasn't nearly as widespread at the time. However, it should be noted that just because some people found justification for their anti-Semitism in the Habaru doesn't mean that there aren't any connections between the Jewish people and the Habaru as described in the Amarna letters. Many biblical and Jewish studies scholars hold the Habaru as being one of many potential ancestors to the Israelites. A more commonly accepted origin for the Jews today is that rather than being an outside people who invaded and conquered the land of Canaan, that they themselves were Canaanites who either saw themselves as being different from the rest of the Canaanites or who purposely differentiated themselves from the rest of the Canaanites. Some like to refer to these Canaanites as Proto-Israelites. These Proto-Israelites would eventually go on to conquer the land of Canaan, renaming it Israel. For most proponents of this theory, the story of Exodus must be completely rejected, which has led to many more Orthodox Jews and conservative Christians rejecting this theory. In contrast to these theories, however, there are some who believe that the ancestry of the Jews is far more recent. When speaking of the ancient Jewish peoples, we are usually referring to the Israelites from the Old Testament. Well, in case you didn't notice, we don't call people Israelites anymore. There are people whom we call Israelis, but that only started after the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948. Some historians argue that we should differentiate between Israelite and Jew because they are very different things. Most historians would date the beginning of this change with the establishment of Israel under King David and the construction of the Temple of Solomon. Before the temple was built, the Israelite religion was nomadic and had a penchant for slipping into polytheism, as described numerous times in the Old Testament. Historians argue that the establishment of a temple in Jerusalem began to transform the Israelite religion, by centralizing its theology and doctrines. The ones who argue this point to the Babylonian exile as the breaking point between when these people transformed from being Israelites to being Jews. They argue that the Jews were created from the exiled leaders of Israel who were forced to relocate to Babylon. Before then, the Israelite religion was based around living in the land that God had promised to Abraham and his descendants. After the exile, the religion became centered around doctrine and social practices that differentiated themselves from the pagans that surrounded them. Now, a lot of this theory delves into material that I want to cover in a later episode, so suffice it to say for now that this theory is not universally accepted. This theory does, however, connect to another area of determining the origins of the Jews, and that is the reliability of the Old Testament sources. In this debate, there are two broad schools of thought. On one hand, there are biblical minimalists who believe that most of what the Old Testament says about the kingdom of Israel is completely fiction. And biblical maximalists who believe that, although not strictly historically accurate, the Old Testament is based on long-standing oral traditions from the Israelites between the 10th and 5th centuries BCE. The biggest area of contention is over the period before the exile. Maximalists hold the position that the biblical narrative should be believed unless explicitly disproven, while minimalists believe that it should not be believed unless explicitly proven. The problem with much of this goes back to what I mentioned before, which is that much of the Old Testament is non-falsifiable. Building on the idea that the Old Testament is not reliable at all as a historical source is a more extreme theory that even most biblical minimalists reject, and that is that modern Jews have absolutely no connection to the Israelites mentioned in the Old Testament.
The Khazar hypothesis asserts that Ashkenazi Jews are either mostly, or in their entirety, descended from a semi-nomadic Turkic group called the Khazars, that had an empire that existed in the North Caucasus and southern Russia between the Black and Caspian Seas.
Let's break down this hypothesis a little bit. What exactly is an Ashkenazi Jew?
The modern Jewish peoples are made up of three main subgroups. There are the Mizrahi Jews, the word Mizrahi coming from the Hebrew word for east. These were Jews who never left the Middle East after any of the conquests or diasporas. Then there are the Sephardi Jews, the word Sephardi coming from the Hebrew word for Hispania or Iberia, meaning they come from modern-day Spain and Portugal. The third and largest of these subgroups are the Ashkenazi Jews, the word Ashkenazi coming from the Hebrew word for Germany, implying their location in Central Europe. So from this understanding, we can see that the Khazar hypothesis is claiming that Ashkenazi Jews are descended from this group of Turks called the Khazars. Okay, so why are anti-Semites claiming the origins of European Jews lie among the Khazars?
Actually, why is the wrong question. The reason why is because it's a means of delegitimizing the modern state of Israel and justifying the horrible atrocities that have been committed to the Ashkenazi Jews, because they weren't real Jews, as if that would have made it better. No. The appropriate question isn't why do they believe this, but how do they justify their claim?
The first leg of their claim is a single primary source from the 10th century. A small collection of letters, referred to as the Khazar Correspondence, was sent between Hasdai ibn Shaprut, a Jewish scholar serving as a foreign secretary to the Caliph of Cordoba, and King Joseph of the Khazars in the 950s and 960s, shortly before the Khazar Khaganate collapsed. In one of his letters, Shaprut said, "I always ask the ambassadors of these monarchs who bring gifts about our brethren the Israelites, the remnant of the captivity, whether they have heard anything concerning the deliverance of those who have languished in bondage and have found no rest." Most scholars have interpreted Shaprut's letter to be asking if the Khazars were one of the lost tribes of Israel expelled after the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests. In his response, King Joseph tells Shaprut that the Khazars are not from one of the 10 lost tribes, but he does believe that they are descended from one of Noah's offspring, Japheth, who was believed at the time to be the progenitor of the peoples of the Aegean, Anatolia, and Asia. However, King Joseph's response did claim that he did practice the Jewish religion and gave a story for the conversion of one of his predecessors to Judaism.
The kings of the Byzantines and the Arabs who had heard of him sent their envoys and ambassadors with great riches and many great presents to the king, as well as some of their wise men, with the object of converting him to their own religion. But the king sent for a learned Israelite. The king searched, inquired, and investigated carefully, and brought the sages together that they might argue their prospective religions.
King Joseph says that this predecessor asked both the Islamic and Christian representative which of the other two religions was better, and that they both answered Judaism. To this, the king is believed to have said,
"If this is so, You both have admitted that with your own mouths that the religion of the Israelites is better. Wherefore, trusting in the mercies of God and the power of the Almighty, I choose the religion of Israel."
From there, Joseph goes on to describe the extent of this conversion.
He circumcised himself, his servants, attendants, and all his people.
A later king is said to have built synagogues, schools, and to have brought scholars in to teach the Torah and the Talmud. However, something that should be noticed about the Khazar correspondence is that it is not a primary source on the conversion of the Khazars to Judaism.
The documents are not from the time period being described, which is believed to have been about 200 years before the actual exchange of the letters. So much of this may in fact just be a legend. What the letter does serve as proof for is that some of the Khazar nobility were practicing some kind of Judaism.
Proponents of the Khazar hypothesis try to make more of this connection than is really there.
They're under the impression that whatever religion the leaders of a polity are, the rest of their people must follow it as well. This is a faulty assumption that probably comes from the European understanding of religion and the state. It assumes that the leaders of a people have more influence on the everyday practices than the evidence merits. And there's evidence that Judaism was not practiced very widely amongst the Khazars. There's documentary evidence from non-Khazar sources from both Muslims and Christians, and neither of them describe the common peoples practicing Judaism. Now, the reason we have to use non-Khazar sources on this issue is because there just aren't that many sources to begin with.
And this is a personal tangent, but don't you think a religion like Judaism, which is heavily reliant upon the written word, would have influenced the amount of writings available if it was as widespread as the legend says?
Anyways, beyond the lack of written sources describing a common practice of Judaism, there is also a lack of archaeological evidence for this hypothesis. There are some coins from the 9th century that refer to Moses as the messenger of God, but this does not imply the commoners were practicing Jews. Rather, it is more evidence that the conversion was limited to those in power, since they would have been the ones with the means of minting coins. If there was an en masse conversion to Judaism, there would have been a lot more archaeological evidence for it. In fact, there's a lot of difficulty in doing research into Khazar archaeology at all, considering their culture was very similar to other Turkic nomads in the region. The Khazar hypothesis also ignores the nature of most Turkic nomad cultures, and that religion was not something that a leader generally pushed on its followers or subjects. We can see this aspect of Central Eurasian nomadic culture extended as far out as the Mongolian Empire, with one of its features praised today being its freedom of religion. It's only in late medieval and early modern Europe that we begin to see a requirement of peoples of a place following the religion of its leader.
So in terms of primary sources, there's not much to go on for the Khazar hypothesis, but you will find a couple secondary sources for the Judaism of the Khazars. Or at least you will find a couple secondary sources that are used to back the claim, but in reality don't.
One is from a Jewish philosopher from Spain, Judah Halevi, with his most famous work, the Kuzari. This work retells the conversion story from the Khazar correspondence. What this work proves is that the story was known to Jews living in 12th century Spain. On top of that, the book isn't a historical work, but rather a philosophical and theological one. Halevi uses the legend of the Khazar conversion to Judaism to exposit why Judaism is philosophically better than Christianity or Islam. Another medieval Jewish reference to the Khazars comes from the Book of Tradition, Sefer HaKabbalah, by Abraham ibn Daud. It's a brief reference in the epilogue. In the latter area, there was a nation of Khazars who converted to Judaism, and their king Joseph sent a letter to Rabbi Hizdai, the Nazi ben Rabbi Isaac ben Shaprut, informing him that he and all his people pursue rabbinate usage scrupulously. We have also seen some of their descendants in Toledo, scholars who informed us that their legal practices conform to rabbinate usage.
There are a couple things that should be noted about this passage that don't entirely hold up the idea that the Khazars converted to Judaism in large numbers.
The text references a nation of Khazars converted to Judaism, which implies that there is more than one and that others didn't convert. It also shows that the author is familiar with the legend. The reference to the descendants who still practice Judaism also implies a separate and distinct identity from those of the Jews of Eastern Europe. The document also fails to say how many descendants of the Jewish Khazars are left. And for all we know, those two scholars aren't actually descended from the Khazars, but rather are practicing Jews from the region where the Khazars were from, had heard about the legend, and adopted it as their own origin. That last bit was a bit of speculation on my part, but because there are so few sources corroborating this story, that's all we can really do with it.
On top of all that, there's no DNA evidence to support the hypothesis. Now, why is this the case? Is it simply because there haven't been studies comparing Khazar DNA to Ashkenazi Jews? Well, kinda.
I say that's only kind of the case because there indeed has been genetic research done into the topic, but none of it has involved comparing an actual Khazar to an Ashkenazi Jew. The reason for this is that there are no Khazars to compare DNA with, or more precisely, there are no groups of people that identify themselves as Khazars or are widely identified by others as Khazars to compare with. The only group in the world today that gets associated with the Khazars are Jews, and that is done almost exclusively by anti-Semites.
There have been a lot of studies on Ashkenazi Jewish populations, and according to a 2013 study published by Wayne State University Press, most Ashkenazi Jews, both those from Eastern and Western Europe, have strong genetic ties.
First, it is possible to assess whether an individual has Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, not only for subjects who identify as having exclusively Ashkenazi Jewish ancestors in recent generations, but also, in many cases, for subjects who report only one or two Ashkenazi Jewish grandparents. Second, Ashkenazi Jewish individuals have relatively long stretches of the genome shared with each other, both in comparison with their genomic sharing with individuals from other populations, and in comparison with levels from within population genomic sharing in these other populations. Third, relatively little observable genetic difference exists between representatives of Eastern and Western Ashkenazi Jewish populations, suggesting that genetically, the Ashkenazi Jewish population approximates a single large community.
This means that if the Khazars are in fact the progenitors of the Ashkenazi Jews, they would be the progenitor of all of them, not just the ones in Eastern Europe. And they would also be the progenitors of the Sephardi Jews as well.
Fourth, considering the Ashkenazi Jewish population in relation to other populations, Ashkenazi Jews show the greatest genetic similarity to Sephardi Jews, and to a lesser extent to North African Jews.
So the Khazar hypothesis is making a pretty big claim. Even if you tried to defuse the claim by saying that the Khazars only formed a portion of Ashkenazi Jews, the DNA evidence suggests that if they form any part of it, it would have to be a large portion, if any at all.
Okay then, so if there are no known Khazar groups other than the one that is accused of secretly hiding it, how can this claim be tested? Well, to do that, you need some kind of substitute for the Khazars. And this is where people trying to support the hypothesis will play with DNA samples and make big presumptions.
People claiming that the Ashkenazi Jews are related to the Khazars will point to a pair of studies, El-Hake, conducted in 2012 and 2016, which concluded that there is strong evidence for Khazar origins for Ashkenazi Jews. But the study begins to fall apart when you look at the details of their methodology. In order to do these studies, you need a substitute gene pool to represent the Khazars, and in most studies they take a population from the Caucasus region. The El-Hake study decided to use Armenians and Georgians as Khazar proxies, and when compared to Ashkenazi Jews there are genetic similarities. The 2013 study quoted earlier points out the major problems with the El-Hake methodology of using Armenians and Georgians as stand-ins for Khazars.
First, because the great variety of populations in the Caucasus region, and the fact that no specific population in the region is known to represent Khazar descendants, evidence for ancestry among Caucasus populations need not reflect Khazar ancestry. Second, even if it were allowed that Caucasus affinities could represent Khazar ancestry, the use of the Armenians and Georgians as Khazar proxies is particularly poor, as they represent the southern part of the Caucasus region, while the Khazar Khaganate was centered in the North Caucasus and further to the north. Furthermore, among populations of the Caucasus, Armenians and Georgians are geographically the closest to the Middle East and are therefore expected a priori to show the greatest genetic similarity to Middle Eastern populations. Indeed, a rather high similarity of South Caucasus populations to Middle Eastern groups was observed at the level of the whole genome in a recent study. Thus, any genetic similarity between Ashkenazi Jews and Armenians and Georgians might merely reflect a common shared Middle Eastern ancestry component, actually providing further support to a Middle Eastern origin of Ashkenazi Jews, rather than a hint for Khazar origin.
Every other study done comparing the DNA of Ashkenazi Jews to other populations in the Northern Caucasus and Southern Russia show no useful connection between the two populations.
Okay, so if my anti-Semitism senses are accurate, and there are any Khazar hypothesis proponents left, they're probably leaving comments to the extent of, you can't trust those studies because they're being funded by Jews and therefore invalid. And my response to that accusation is, I'm not trying to convince you. If you believe the Khazar hypothesis at this point, it's probably not because of the evidence. I have yet to meet any person or come across any written work supporting the Khazar hypothesis that isn't also being fueled by anti-Semitism or hatred for the modern state of Israel.
For white anti-Semites, this means that the atrocities committed against the Jews throughout European history are okay because they weren't really Jews. This is especially important for Christian anti-Semites. because to persecute Jews is to persecute the chosen people of God, and you can't have that. And also, if they are Khazars, that means that they are nomadic thieves who produce nothing of their own. In other words, parasites. And the world would be better off without them. There's also the bonus that if the Jews aren't really Jews, then that means hating them doesn't make you an anti-Semite. And if you're an Arab or Islamic anti-Semite, then your support for the Khazar hypothesis is because it delegitimizes the modern state of Israel. It does this because one of the main arguments for why Zionist Jews should be allowed to set up a state of their own in the Levant was that their ancestors were from there. But if European Jews are in reality Khazars, then the Zionists, and therefore the state of Israel, lose their legitimacy.
Boy, am I not looking forward to all the anti-Semitic comments and possibly death threats I'm gonna get from this video.
On top of the written and DNA evidence for the Khazar hypothesis notwithstanding basic analysis, we know for a fact that European Jewry don't come from the Khazars because there were Jews in Europe before the supposed conversion of the Khazars in the 8th century. When Alexander the Great conquered the Levant, Jews migrated to other parts of his empire, and even after his death, a connection between the two cultures remained intact. Jews were known to live on the islands of the Aegean, such as Rhodes and Crete. We see references to Jews in the works of the Greek geographer Strabo and the Roman philosopher Seneca, both of whom reference Jews living in Greece and Rome. The New Testament book of Acts, along with the Roman historian Suetonius, both reference the expulsion of Jews from the city of Rome under Emperor Claudius in the 1st century CE. Historians of the Jewish peoples have traced written references in archaeological sites of Jewish settlement through late antiquity and the Middle Ages. This shows a migration of Jews coming out of Italy, moving north into modern France, and then eastward into Germany and southward into Spain and Portugal. Jews started migrating to Eastern Europe due to the expulsions from England in 1290, from France in 1394, and parts of Germany throughout the 15th century. As I said in the previous episode, the Jews of Eastern Europe came from Western Europe.
I'll go further into detail about these expulsions in a later episode, but for now, this will have to suffice. So now that I have thoroughly debunked the Khazar hypothesis, or at least debunked it enough for the viewers of this platform, let's move on to what genetics actually tells us about the origins of the Jewish peoples.
In a 2010 study, researchers found that Ashkenazi Jews share a common Middle Eastern ancestor with Mizrahi Jews, along with having mixes of European ancestry.
Genome-wide analysis of 7 Jewish groups and comparison with non-Jewish groups demonstrated distinctive Jewish population clusters, each with shared Middle Eastern ancestry, proximity to contemporary Middle Eastern populations, and variable degrees of European and North African admixture.
Another study from 2014 also supports this claim.
Modeling of ancient histories for AJ and European populations using their joint allele frequency spectrum determines AJ to be an even admixture of European and likely Middle Eastern origins. We date the split between the two ancestral populations to be approximately 12 to 25 kiloyears, suggesting a predominantly Near Eastern source for the repopulation of Europe after the last glacial maximum.
A 2017 study gave an estimated breakdown between European and Middle Eastern genetic sources amongst Ashkenazi Jews.
Running RF mix on the AJ genomes with our EU and ME reference panels, and summing up the lengths of all tracks assigned to each ancestry, the genome-wide ancestry was approximately 53% EU and 47% ME, consistent with our previous estimate based on a smaller sequencing panel.
Other studies done before and after these ones have also produced similar results. So for those of you wondering why Jews look white despite coming from a Middle Eastern population, it's because they intermarried with non-Jewish Europeans.
Okay, so before we look at what academics and scholars have to say about Exodus, we should probably take a look at what the traditional narrative says about the story. And before you keyboard atheists get your trilbies and neckbeards in a twist, just know that this is something historians call historiography. I made a video about it a while ago, which you can check out here. Now, with that out of the way, let's get moving. The story of Exodus actually begins in the book of Genesis, when Joseph, the son of Jacob and the great-grandson of Abraham, is sold into slavery by his brothers and is then taken to Egypt. While in Egypt, he manages to rise quickly through the ranks of the Egyptian court through his talent for interpreting dreams. He gets appointed the Grand Vizier of Egypt, where he implements numerous policies that allow Egypt to collect grain during years of abundance, which allows them to dole it out during years of drought and famine. While the famine was going on in the land of Canaan, Joseph's brothers come down to Egypt to get grain, and after a series of deceptions, Joseph reveals to his brothers that he is the younger brother that they had sold into slavery all those years ago. He then invites the rest of his family back in Canaan to come down to Egypt and settle in the land of Goshen near the Nile Delta. Joseph would serve as Grand Vizier for the remainder of his life. The descendants of his father Jacob, also known as Israel, would become the Israelites in Egypt, and would grow in number over the 430 years spent there. Eventually, a pharaoh who did not know Joseph would come to power, and at this point the Israelites would begin facing persecution, as they would be enslaved and forced into construction work rather than their traditional herding. One pharaoh began to fear the growing number of Israelites within Egypt, so he ordered the execution of all male Israelite infants. This resulted in one Jewish mother putting her baby, Moses, in a basket and sending it down the river, where he would be found by the daughter of the pharaoh of Egypt and raised in her household. After an incident where Moses killed an overseer abusing an Israelite slave, he fled into the wilderness, where he joined up with the nomadic Midianites. While in this self-imposed exile, he came into contact with God in the form of a burning bush, who told him to go back to Egypt, free the Israelites from slavery, and lead them to the promised land. He obeyed God and returned to Egypt, where he confronted the pharaoh. After a series of plagues, he was allowed to leave with the Israelites, but not before Pharaoh changed his mind, chased them to the Red Sea, where the Israelites crossed into the Sinai. The Egyptian army chasing them would be swallowed by the sea as it closed. And while in the Sinai, Moses receives the 10 Commandments and leads the Israelites to the promised land, only to be turned back because the Israelites feared the people living there, at which point they were forbidden from entering Canaan for another 40 years. This is the traditional narrative around the Exodus story, and it's a vital part of all the Abrahamic religions, but how much of any of it can said to be true? When it comes to events depicted in the Old Testament, especially the 5 books of Moses, historians and archaeologists aren't so much proving or disproving something so much as they are calculating probabilities. One of the reasons for this is because we don't know exactly when Exodus is supposed to have taken place. The Bible doesn't give us an exact time period of when it happened, and although there is a surprising amount of accurate detail about ancient Egypt in the Bible, it still doesn't give us enough detail to nail down a specific time period in which we could place the events. Because of this, most historians and archaeologists, or at least those within academia, have reached the broad consensus that Exodus, as described in the Bible, didn't happen. Some will go so far as to say that Exodus didn't or couldn't have happened at all, but most don't go that far. Lester L. Grab, author of Ancient Israel, What We Know and How We Know It, gives this caveat to the work of archaeologists. The use of archaeological data is just as subjective and interpretive as data from texts. Some archaeologists give the impression that it is objective, that archaeology somehow speaks by itself. Despite this, however, there are still quite a few archaeological problems with the story of Exodus, namely the lack of material evidence for it happening. The book of Exodus describes the migration of 600,000 Israelite men, not including women or children, out of Egypt. On top of the Israelites leaving Egypt, other groups are said to have joined them. The lowball estimate, including women and children, is around 2.4 million people. The 600,000 number stated in the text would have included about a quarter of the total population of late Bronze Age Egypt, meaning the lowball estimate would have been close to the entire population. There is no way a group that size leaving a country overland on foot would not have left a noticeable mark on Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, or the Levant. These staggering numbers are hard to justify archaeologically, which is why even the most evangelical of biblical archaeologists don't defend the numbers in the text. So when you look at the textual evidence, such as the description of Joseph's ceremony when he became Grand Vizier in Egypt, or the description of nomadic peoples going to Egypt during times of famine in the Fertile Crescent, there seems to be too much accurate detail about the ancient world there for it to have been based on nothing. Well, if it can't be based on nothing, then what might it be based on? The first step is in deciphering when it might or could have happened. The text itself doesn't give any evidence as for when it may have happened. Because of this, most apologetic biblical archaeologists look for analogous events in Egyptian history that line up pretty closely with the Exodus narrative. Since the text doesn't give us any explicit evidence as to when it's happening, is there anything outside the text that might give us some parameters? Well, in fact, there is. The earliest reference to the Israelites outside of their own texts is the Mernepta Stell, an inscription made under the reign of Pharaoh Mernepta, which stated that Israel is laid waste and his seed is not. The inscription tells a number of things. Its explicit reference to Israel says that by 1200 BCE, the Israelites were a distinct entity within the land of Canaan. It also tells us that the Egyptians had a habit of exaggerating their victories, and we know this because Israel would continue to exist and conquer much of the Levant. And for those looking to date the Exodus, it says you need to pick a time prior to 1200 BCE. A popular option amongst apologetic biblical archaeologists is the period of the Hyksos expulsion. The Hyksos were Semitic peoples who migrated to Egypt during the late Middle Kingdom, and founded the 15th dynasty at the start of the Second Intermediate Period. The Hyksos would rule Egypt for about a century until they were overthrown by the 17th dynasty coming out of Memphis, and later expelled from Egypt by the 18th dynasty. Although Egyptian inscriptions don't really refer to Israel before 1200 BCE, they do refer to the Hyksos. However, they don't do so in as much detail as prior or succeeding dynasties. In The Bible is History, a German journalist and anti-Nazi resistance fighter Werner Keller says, "The names of these Hyksos rulers, who were so cordially detested by Egyptians, have hardly been recorded, far less the names of their dignitaries and officials. Even if this pharaoh of the new dynasty had known of Joseph, that is as far as he would have wanted it to go. Joseph was bound to be an object of contempt to any national conscious Egyptian." It does make sense that Egyptians wouldn't want to record much of what happened involving the Hyksos, considering that they like to downplay any reversals in their history, and being occupied by a foreign power that are usually denigratingly referred to as Asiatics sounds like a reversal. We also see connections with the government of Egypt under the Hyksos. Although we don't have nearly as much information on the Hyksos as we do on prior or succeeding dynasties, what little information we have shows a lot of Semitic names amongst the government ministers. On top of that, the Hyksos moved the capital of Egypt to Avaris in the Nile Delta, which is near the land of Goshen, the region the Israelites are said to have been settled. Apologists looking for parallels with the story of Exodus often postulate that the Israelites may have either been a part of the Hyksos expulsion, or they may have at some later point appropriated the story for themselves. Another piece of evidence of the Hebrews spending time in Egypt is the presence of Egyptian names amongst the ancient Israelites, in particular that of the most prominent one, Moses. The name Moses is derived from an Egyptian word meaning born of, and we see it as a suffix to many pharaohs' names, such as Ramesses, meaning born of Ra, and Tuthmoses, meaning born of Toth. However, we need to keep in mind that none of these similarities prove that the Hyksos expulsion is what the book of Exodus is talking about. There's also the fact that it was the Hyksos that were actively expelled from Egypt by the 18th dynasty, rather than them trying to escape. Some of this could theoretically be chalked up to Egyptian propaganda spin, but it seems to me that a migration that large would only be tolerated if there was an active effort by the ruling dynasty to get rid of them. And when it comes to the Egyptian names found amongst the ancient Israelites, the Egyptians under the Hyksos traded extensively with the Levant, and after the expulsion, Egypt conquered the land of Canaan. In The Origin of the Jews, a book I've cited in this series before, the author says, "Some see Hyksos rule as the historical background for the biblical story of Joseph, and the expulsion of the Hyksos as the historical kernel of the Exodus story. However that may be, we also know that Canaan in the late Bronze Age was under Egyptian control, that there was contact between the rulers of Canaan cities and the court of Amarna, and that Egyptian culture almost certainly had direct influence on ancient Israelite culture and literature. Basically, all of the knowledge of ancient Egypt among the Israelites and later the Jews could just as easily been explained by the Egyptian occupation of the Levant as it could have from a Jewish presence in Egypt. And unlike the story of Exodus, we have historical evidence that the Egyptians occupied the Levant. Since the Hyksos-Israelite connection isn't clear enough to make any definitive answers, let's go to the more popular candidate, Ramesses II. Ramesses II was the third pharaoh of the 19th dynasty and reigned from 1279 to 1213 BCE, one of the longest reigns for a monarch in history. His son was Mernepta, the pharaoh who claimed to have made waste of Israel. If you've seen a movie about the Exodus, it's Ramesses II who is usually the antagonist, and it's Ramesses II who many place as the pharaoh in the Exodus story. So why do so many people believe that it was Ramesses II? There are some biblical details backing up this assertion. The book of Exodus describes the Israelites building two cities, Pithom and Ramses. Under the reign of Seti I and Ramesses II, two military garrison cities, Pi-Ramesses and Per-Atam, were built in the Nile Delta in order to service their military campaigns in the Levant. Given this geographic detail, it is believed by many historians that Ramesses was the intended pharaoh by the authors of Exodus. Dr. David Nyman, a rabbi and archaeologist, places the Exodus story during the reigns of Seti I and Ramesses II, whom he ascribes the classical roles of the pharaoh of the oppression and the pharaoh of Exodus respectively. One of the problems most historians and archaeologists have with Ramesses II being depicted as the pharaoh of Exodus is that Ramesses II's reign is one of the most powerful of the 19th dynasty. And the likelihood of something like Exodus, even a scaled down version, happening under his watch seems to be unlikely. Dr. Nyman, however, proposes that Exodus happened after the Battle of Kadesh, a battle between the Egyptians and the Hittites in which Ramesses II had a technical victory, but lost a lot of his army. And in this period of weakness, the Israelites made their escape from Egypt. The way I'm describing his thesis does not give it justice, so if you have Amazon Prime, you can watch the lecture on it there for free. So if you want more details, go there. There's two more quick things to cover about the Exodus narrative: the plagues and slavery. So firstly, the plagues, most of them are actually just sort of natural phenomena that occur after larger than average flooding. Some of them are a little more supernaturalistic, but most of them are, for the most part, completely natural phenomena in that part of the world. Now, as for slavery, it's a bit of a different story. When we think of slavery today, we tend to think of the chattel slavery of the Atlantic slave trade. However, ancient Egypt didn't have something like that. Rather, what they had was more akin to a kind of forced conscription, where individuals are required to provide a certain amount of labor to the government for a certain amount of time every year. Now, depending on who you ask, this is or isn't slavery, but considering the fact that there are commie left tubers on YouTube who think wage jobs are considered slavery, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to think of this as being ancient Egyptian slavery, regardless of whether or not the Israelites were there at all. On top of this, if the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, they couldn't have been credited for building the pyramids because the pyramids were already built by the time the story could have taken place. I mean, even the Bible doesn't claim the Israelites built the pyramids. The reason we usually come to this conclusion is simply because the pyramids are the most iconic landmarks of the country. So, did the Exodus happen? Well, there are people like me who take it on faith that it did. And although I do believe one day we will find more evidence that supports its historicity, I'm not going to sit here and claim that the evidence is all in its favor, because it clearly isn't. Okay, then what about the option that the Exodus story isn't supposed to be a historical event? There are a good number of people who think that it's supposed to be an allegory for exile for the Jews living in exile during the time it was written. This idea comes from the fact that the book of Exodus, along with the other books of Moses, were first written during the Babylonian exile, when the leaders from the southern Israelite kingdom of Judah were captured by the Babylonians and relocated to the city of Babylon. It is inferred by some historians that during this time, separated from their homeland, the Jews were concerned about retaining their religious, cultural, and ethnic identity. So to do this, they began to write down the stories and laws that had been passed down orally through their nomadic priests and their temples in Jerusalem. Given this, some people propose that the story of Exodus is an allegory for exile because just like the Jews being held captive in Babylon, the Israelites in the Exodus were also in exile against their will. However, I don't buy this interpretation. The 5 books of Moses tell the story of the creation of the world, and it goes through the creation of laws by God for the Israelites wandering through the desert. It gives a lot of genealogy and a lot of accurate historical details, even if not nailed down to a specific time period. If the main purpose of these writings was to preserve their religion, law, and social order, then why weave a narrative with that much detail? Let's look at another law code that is often credited with inspiring Old Testament law, the Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi has all the stuff Exodus has, except for a narrative explaining why it exists. Surely the people who were writing the laws down must have been exposed to Hammurabi's code, especially because they were being held in the city he was king of. If all you need is to preserve a social order, you don't need a narrative of liberation along with it. I don't think the people who wrote Exodus thought they were crafting a fictional narrative. It is my belief, my contention, that they believed every word that they were writing. If you read what other Jews wrote about Exodus later, such as Josephus or what is said in the New Testament, they definitely believed that Exodus was, at least in part, a historical text, rather than an allegorical one. And there is plenty of evidence within the text itself that the writers had plenty of accurate knowledge about ancient Egypt. Or, as John Romer put it, in this genuine historical environment, the Egyptian careers of the patriarchs, of Joseph, who entered Egypt as a slave and rose to control civil administration of the land, or the biblical adventures of Moses, a foreigner foundling raised in an Egyptian court, are entirely plausible. But Romer also said this in regards to the surprisingly accurate details in Genesis and Exodus. However strong such cultural concordances are, they can never supply the proof that such stories record genuine historical events, or that characters in them ever lived. Theories that attempt to link biblical details with ancient lifestyles rely more on our ignorance of the past than our knowledge of it. What I've talked about so far is nowhere near exhaustive of what there is to say about the subject, but what I hope is that it serves as a jumping off point for further study. At this point, I think I'm going to let Lester L. Grab end this discussion. This does not rule out the possibility that the text contains a distant and distorted memory of an actual event. Some feel that the tradition is so strong in the Bible that some actual event must lie behind it. Today we are looking at the Israelite conquest of Canaan, or perhaps it's more accurate to call it the settlement of Canaan, or perhaps the whole thing is a myth. So like the previous episodes, let's start with the biblical narrative. After the Exodus, the Israelites are said to have wandered through the desert for 40 years. By the end of that period, most of the original generation that had left Egypt was dead, including their leader Moses, who was succeeded by Joshua. Joshua would lead the military campaign into Canaan. They crossed the Jordan River into the land and came to their first battle at the city of Jericho.
What are you doing?
We're going to knock your wall down.
By walking around in circles?
Yes.
The Israelites form an alliance with the Gibeonites, who convinced the Israelites that they were not among the Canaanites whom God had ordered them to exterminate. An alliance of Amorite cities, led by the Canaanite king of Jerusalem, forms to resist the Israelites, but are defeated in battle with the aid of divine intervention. Another anti-Israelite alliance is formed in the north and led by the king of Hazor, but they too are defeated in battle, and the city of Hazor is destroyed. After the defeat of the Canaanites, the land of Canaan was divided up amongst the 12 Israelite tribes. The tribes of Reuben and Gad were given lands east of the Jordan River, which the Israelites had conquered before their invasion of Canaan, while the rest of the tribes were given land west of the Jordan River. Upon Joshua's death, the tribes remained in a loose confederation led by local leaders called judges, who orchestrated campaigns against the non-Canaanites still in the land, the Philistines. It was the fight against the Philistines that unified the Israelites into a single kingdom, but we're stopping the narrative just short of that for this episode. Okay, so the traditional narrative around the Israelite takeover of Canaan is very much in line with stories of the time period. A rapid conquest of the land via military victories. But how much of this can be said to be true? Well, like much of the earlier parts of the Hebrew Bible, you can't really prove the historicity of the characters mentioned. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't exist. What it does mean, however, is that we have to be honest about the historical and archaeological record as it currently exists. Okay then, how do academics see the conquest of Canaan? Well, there are four models typically used when looking at it. The conquest model, the peaceful infiltration model, the peasants revolt model, and the agricultural resettlement model, sometimes referred to as the invisible Israelites model. Each of these models tries a different method of rationalizing the archaeological and textual sources, with varying degrees of concern for the biblical narrative. The conquest model holds the most esteem for the traditional narrative. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists excavated sites across Palestine, one of which being the most famous conquest, Jericho. Some of these earlier excavations found that the city was indeed fortified with walls, and at some point they were burned down. Similar instances were found at many of the other sites mentioned in the biblical narrative. These sites also showed evidence of having been reoccupied by a new culture at some point after their walls were burned down. The problem with this model, however, is the chronology. As mentioned in the previous episode, the earliest known reference to the Israelites as a distinct entity came from the Mernepta Stell, around 1207 BCE. The conquest of Canaan is believed to have happened in the late 13th century BCE. However, the exact message of the Stell references the defeat of the Israelites. They may not have been overwhelmingly defeated like the Stell claims, but they must have suffered some kind of setback. There's also the problem that the 13th century was the strongest period for the New Kingdom Egypt, especially for its presence in Canaan, which it controlled at the time, which makes a sudden rapid conquest by a semi-nomadic tribe less likely. On top of that, the archaeological evidence doesn't support the chronology. Yes, a number of cities mentioned in the text were burnt down at some point, but most of those burnings were 200 plus years prior to when the conquest would have taken place. And during the times of the conquest, most of the mentioned sites were scantily populated. Okay then, what about the peaceful infiltration model? In contrast to the previous theory,
This model believes that the Israelite takeover of Canaan was gradual and mostly peaceful. This model is backed up by some of the biblical texts, such as the peace made with the Gibeonites, as well as the lack of battle descriptions for the conquest of central Canaan in the book of Joshua. It proposes that the Israelites were a semi-nomadic group that gradually transitioned into a more sedentary culture, which came into conflict with the local Canaanite groups over land. They believe the evidence of the burned down cities can be attributed to attacks by the Sea Peoples, mentioned in the histories of the Bronze Age collapse. This model proposes that the book of Joshua is an teleological text, which is concerned with giving explanations for why things are the way it is. However, this model is often criticized for relying too much on the teleological method, especially when there is a surprising amount of accurate details given in the biblical text. So then what about the Peasants Revolt model? Well, this model argues that the Israelites were not a nomadic group at all, but rather were a class of people living in Canaan. This model contends that the tribes in ancient times were groups based around social class rather than genealogy. In this interpretation, the conquest is really a peasant revolt in which peoples living in rural areas overthrew the urban rulers. If you remember the theories covered in episode 1, this sounds a lot like the Habaru theory coming from the Amarna letters. Well, this theory does indeed come out of that one. Some proponents of the theory incorporate some of the Exodus narrative into it, believing that a tribe coming out of Egypt, this time a religiously oriented one, was practicing a monotheistic religion, and when they tried to settle in Canaan, they were turned away by the Canaanite rulers. They then led the local peasants in rebellion against the cities and conquered the land for the workers. This theory was developed in the 60s and was influenced by Marxism and Leninism. It's very Marxist in that it reinterprets the evidence to be about class conflict, and it's very Leninist in its assertion that some kind of vanguard or revolutionary leadership was needed to spark revolt. This theory is heavily criticized for placing a modern construct like class on peoples in the ancient world, who would have been far more concerned with familial links than those of economic status. So then, what about the last theory, the agricultural resettlement model? This model is a modification of the peaceful infiltration model, in that it holds that the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites was gradual and mostly peaceful. In contrast to the peaceful infiltration model, however, it believes that there is a kernel of truth to the Exodus and conquest narratives. It believes the bulk of the Israelite population remained in the land of Canaan, where a small portion have spent some time in Egypt. When the Egyptians began to militarily withdraw from Canaan after the Bronze Age collapse, the Israelites began to conquer their neighbors. Now, some people believe that the discrepancies between the archaeological evidence and the text of the Bible should discount the latter as a source for the history of the region. However, this is coming from a fundamental misunderstanding of the texts. The narrative from Joshua to Kings is a unified and continuous telling of Israel's story, but it was not a narrative that was content to rehearse dry facts of the situation. Instead, each of the books used its story to make theological points based on the narration of the events. Each book was convinced that it was the nation's sins that had, in each case, brought the people and its succession of leaders in harm's way. Ultimately, archaeology can neither prove nor disprove the Old Testament, only modern theories about what it might mean. Basically, the biblical text has a lot to say about the period, and as covered in previous episodes, it has far too many accurate details about the ancient world to just write it off. And of course, if you treat the Bible this way because of fantastical elements in its narrative, then I have a few other texts you need to reevaluate as well.
King David and Solomon are two of the most famous characters in the Bible, and feature prominently in its histories. But how much do we know about those two? And considering what we've talked about in previous episodes of this series, can we even be sure that they existed at all? Well, before we get into the history, let's tackle that last question first. When it comes to the stories of Exodus or the Conquest, we have to be more skeptical simply because there is little evidence outside of the text of the Hebrew Bible. But when talking about the ancient kingdom of Israel, we're playing a different game. Now, for most of the last 1,000 years or so, we have more or less believed the history as told in the Bible unquestionably. However, in the last century or so, we've begun to question the narrative, question its historicity, whether or not it actually happened. And in questioning whether or not it happened as the Bible described it, led to people coming to the question of, well, did King David and Solomon even exist? And the biggest supporters of this argument was more or less a negative argument, as in a lack of evidence for these characters outside of the Bible itself. There were some reasonable counter-arguments to these points, such as much of the archaeological evidence having been destroyed by the numerous invasions of ancient Israel, along with the numerous attempts by rulers such as Herod the Great to rebuild Jerusalem, which would have involved destroying some of the older architecture. There's also the fact that around the time the Kingdom of Israel would have existed, the surrounding powers were in periods of decline, which tended to create either a lack of written sources altogether or ones that focused on internal affairs.
However, these arguments don't create positive evidence for the historicity of the Hebrew Bible, and by the 1990s, it looked like the radical position was going to win out, and that we were just going to accept that David and Solomon never existed.
But in 1993, a discovery was made in northern Israel at Tel Dan. A tablet dated to the 9th century BCE was found that read, "I killed Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of the house of David. And I set their towns into ruins and turned their land into desolation."
And there they had it, a source outside of the Bible that confirmed the existence of King David, the kings of Judah and Israel, and the house of David as a whole.
This discovery set the world of biblical archaeology ablaze, and gave new hopes to biblical maximalists that more of the Bible might be proven true with enough time.
And with that, I think we have established the historicity of Kings David and Solomon. And with them being real, that grants a lot more credibility to the biblical narrative. However much of it can be said to be word-for-word truth is debated, but most historians at this point are willing to use the Hebrew Bible from that point forward as a general outline for what the history of ancient Israel probably was, if not a word-for-word exact outline. In the previous episode, we talked about the numerous theories around the Israelite conquest of Canaan, ones that evolved a hypothetical exodus and ones that didn't. We mostly focus on the narrative as it is described in the book of Joshua. However, there is another book that describes the conquest of Canaan, and that is the book of Judges.
This time between the conquest and establishment of the Kingdom of Israel is usually referred to as the period of the Judges. The Israelites were divided into 12 tribes, who would war with each other as frequently as against their enemies. Amongst them, a series of political, military, and religious leaders would emerge, referred to as judges, to lead them in wars against their neighbors, most prominently the Philistines. The Philistines were most likely one of the Sea Peoples, referred to in Egyptian sources of the Bronze Age collapse. They probably came in numerous waves as families or villages, fleeing some problem in their homes in the Aegean Sea. We suspect that they were from the Aegean due to their pottery, which has more similarities with those found in Mycenae than those made in the rest of Canaan. The biblical narrative gives the stories of numerous fights against the Philistines, such as the stories of Deborah, Eli, or Samson. Even if the details of these wars, or even the exact characters, are not historical, doesn't mean that they aren't describing a historical reality. Whether Samson ever lived or not is hardly relevant to the significance of the stories. They certainly describe real historical circumstances, that the scribes of the books of Samuel order his tales in the classic manners of myth, aid their deeper purpose. Samson's downfall tells us of that result of violating Jehovah's law. The Bible tells us that after generations of fighting, the Philistines managed to capture the Ark of the Covenant and destroy the tabernacle it was kept in, which had been under the inept protection of the prophet Samuel's sons. Samuel was the last judge to emerge among the Israelites, along with serving the role of prophet, which in the Bible was more than just someone who predicted the future, but also served as an advisor to political rulers. In his younger days, Samuel had led a religious revival that spurred on a war against the Philistines. But in his old age, he wasn't able to do the fighting or administering of justice anymore. And after his sons failed to protect the most important religious artifact of the Israelites, the people demanded that he appoint a king who could coordinate justice and military campaigns. So Samuel anointed a warlord from the tribe of Benjamin, Saul, who was already garnering a following from his successes against the Philistines.
There are disputes as to exactly how he gained the title of king, and the Bible demonstrates this by giving multiple instances of Saul gaining power.
Either by an anointing by Samuel, military victory, or even being given the title by chance by a drawing of lots. This uncertainty in exactly how he gained power makes me believe that Saul was probably a real character similar to David and Solomon. When all is said and done, the biblical sources remain our best sources on David and his times. Had the same materials been available from an external source, which nevertheless named a number of pagan deities, it would have been accorded much more serious treatment compared to the usual reception given to biblical materials. The entirety of Saul's reign was spent fighting the enemies of the Israelites, and in his later years fighting a rebel, the future King David. How exactly David comes into the picture of Israelite politics is also uncertain. We all know the story of David and Goliath, in which he gains favor by proving himself in battle against the Philistines. However, there is another story about how he was a musician in Saul's court, as well as the king's armor-bearer. But in both these stories, Saul acts as though this was the first time meeting with David.
So this, similar to the multiple stories about how Saul gained the title of king, gives the impression that the books of Samuel are an attempt to reconcile multiple competing narratives.
David must have been seen as a usurper to the throne by many in ancient Israel, which explains the many religious justifications given for his right to rule, such as King Saul losing God's favor by violating the authority of the priests when he made a burnt offering to God, which implies some kind of separation of powers between the secular and ecclesiastical. It's also possible that King Saul slipped into pagan religious practices like many Israelites had done, by engaging in necromancy such as with the story of the Witch of Endor, when he summons the spirit of the long-dead prophet Samuel for military advice.
Both the archaeology and the biblical narrative demonstrate that the Israelites had a hard time maintaining perfect practice of monotheism. However, these stories could also just as easily be propaganda created by the court of David in order to justify his overthrow of King Saul.
During his war with King Saul, David made an alliance with the Philistines. He also broke off a portion of the Israelites, the tribe of Judah, into a separate kingdom centered in Hebron, where he would rule until Saul's death, at which point either his son or grandson, Ishbosheth, succeeded him. However, he was betrayed by his commanders and killed, which allowed David to solidify control over Israel, creating a united monarchy. Similar to Saul, much of David's rule was spent fighting Israel's neighbors, the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites. One of the most consequential battles of King David's reign was conquering the city of Jerusalem from the Jebusites. Jerusalem was a very important location for the creation of a unified Israelite kingdom. The city sat on land that was never dominated by any of the tribes, which made it a politically neutral spot for a capital. It was also centrally located between the more densely populated northern valleys and the more sparsely populated southern desert, controlled by the tribe of Judah. David also began the process of trying to unify and codify the Israelite religion. The biblical narrative is constantly talking about how the Israelites were drifting away from monotheism and worshipping foreign gods. Whether these gods were actually foreign or just gods that the priestly class asserted they shouldn't worship anymore, the archaeological evidence supports this narrative, finding idols, inscriptions, or murals in ancient Israelite religious sites, implying an imperfect practice of monotheism.
The biblical narrative describes the efforts of both King David and King Saul in trying to unify the Israelite peoples through a common set of religious practices, and it's a lot easier to do this if you can centralize the religion in a single location.
David did this late in his reign by having the Ark of the Covenant, which had been taken back from the Philistines by this point, brought to the new capital in Jerusalem. He also began procuring the materials to build a temple in the city, but he wouldn't build it himself. The biblical narrative said that David was too ritually unclean to build the temple because of all the blood he spilled from all the wars he fought. But in reality, he was probably trying to avoid angering the priestly class, which gives some credibility to the stories of Saul violating Israelite religious laws. David's reign would see two succession crises. The first succession crisis occurred when his son Absalom, born to a foreign princess, rebelled against his father by having himself proclaimed king in Hebron. Absalom had been left in charge of domestic affairs when David was out fighting wars, which was quite often, so Absalom was a better politician, but David was a better military strategist. Absalom was eventually killed in battle by one of David's generals, Joab, who was reprimanded for it. A second succession crisis would occur when David's fourth son, Adonijah, tried to get himself proclaimed king over his younger half-brother, Solomon. Despite being younger, Solomon was seen by most as the preferred heir to King David, especially after he had been made a regent for King David in his later years. And he was supported by those who had supported David in his rebellion against Saul, as well as by the court prophet, Nathan. In contrast, Adonijah was supported by the military, the priests, and the former supporters of King Saul. Adonijah and Joab, the leader of David's military, plotted a coup to have Adonijah proclaimed king as soon as they heard about David's death. But before that could occur, the prophet Nathan warned Solomon's mother Bathsheba of the plot, and the two of them told King David, who agreed to let Solomon be anointed king before his own death, thereby circumventing the coup. Solomon would later have both Adonijah and Joab executed in order to prevent any future plots.
As king, Solomon continued the policies of his father by trying to centralize the kingdom, all the while granting special privileges to the tribe of Judah.
Within the kingdom of Israel, the tribes were required to pay taxes, as well as provide a labor force to the king to construct forts, temples, and other infrastructure. However, the tribe of Judah was exempted. This was partly done because the line of David came from the tribe of Judah, but it's also likely because the land occupied by the tribe of Judah was less prosperous and developed than those in the northern valleys. To this day, southern Israel is still mostly desert, so even if he wanted to extract more resources from them, they probably didn't have much to extract in the first place. He probably also wanted to keep them on the good side of the king, due to their history of siding with whoever is trying to overthrow the monarch. The most famous aspect of Solomon's reign would have to be his efforts in centralizing the Israelite religion around a temple in Jerusalem. In this temple, the holiest artifact of their religion, the Ark of the Covenant, would be stored. This means that the priests charged with its care were also given the greatest authority in determining religious orthodoxy. They discouraged the building of temples elsewhere in Israel out of fear of creating religious schisms. They also forbid the practice of animal sacrifice outside the Temple of Jerusalem as another means of maintaining their authority.
Along with his religious policies, Solomon is also known for his great wisdom and many, many wives.
The story of Solomon threatening to cut a baby in half to see which woman claiming to be its mother was its real mother probably comes to mind. Of course, I'm certainly not the only one wondering why anybody would be okay with cutting up a baby, but apparently it was necessary to find out who really cared.
And when it came to Solomon's many wives, this was largely done for political reasons, to ensure alliances, trade relations, and peace between neighboring countries, which wouldn't have been uncommon at the time at all.
However, the biblical narrative credits his marriages with foreign women as what ultimately resulted in Solomon's downfall. His marriages to these foreign princesses included a requirement for him to send offerings to the temples of these pagan pantheons, which upset God, who in turn took Solomon's wisdom from him. This declining mental state allowed once subdued neighbors such as the Edomites to reassert themselves. Solomon also had further troubles with the north, when the prophet Elijah said that the son of a former minister from the tribe of Ephraim, Jeroboam, would one day rule the 10 northern tribes. Solomon tried to have Jeroboam killed, but he fled to Egypt for safety. Upon Solomon's death in 931, his son, Rehoboam, ascended to the throne, and his first policy was to demand more taxes from the 10 northern tribes. Led by Jeroboam, the northern 10 tribes rebel and proclaim their own kingdom. While fighting this rebellion, Israel was also invaded by Egypt, and they besieged Jerusalem, to which Rehoboam is said to have given all the treasures of the temple to the Egyptians in exchange for peace. At which point the remnants of David's kingdom, now reduced to Judah, became a vassal of Egypt. Rehoboam would spend the rest of his reign trying to reunify the kingdom. His son, Abijam, would continue this fight for his short reign, but by the end it was clear that North and South, now split, would never be reunited under a single Israelite crown.
When using the Bible as a source for history, especially within academia, the closer you get to the present, the more reliable it's considered to be. And although there are still disputes over the historicity of particular events, it is still used as a general guideline for the history of that region at the time. But the periods of, say, King David and Solomon, although less externally corroborated, are far easier to make sense of than the following period of the kingdoms of the North and South, which even the Bible has trouble keeping straight.
It's so complicated that St. Jerome, the priest who translated the Bible into Latin, is believed to have said, "Read all the books of the Old Testament, and you will find such discord as to the number of the years of the kings of Judah and Israel, that to attempt to clear up this question will appear rather the occupation of a man of leisure than of a scholar."
You see, when you add up the number of years the different kings of Israel and Judah are said to have reigned, they don't really line up super well, and scholars haven't come up with a universally accepted means of deciphering the information. However, there are some that are more accepted than others. And the title of that goes to Edwin R. Thiel.
In 1951, Thiel published The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, which seeks to disentangle the reigns of the kings of Israel and Judah. He did this through a combination of accounting for concepts such as ascension years and co-reigning. He also discovered that the two kingdoms used slightly varied calendars, with the northern kingdom's new year starting in the spring and the southern kingdoms starting in the fall. He was able to reconcile the biblical data with the non-biblical sources. Thiel's chronology has been criticized on numerous points, but none of the criticisms have been strong enough to tank the whole thing. The most persistent criticism has been his use of inductive reasoning. That is, coming up with a theory based on the data, rather than coming up with a theory and testing it against the data. For about a century prior to his work's publication, scholarly attitudes towards the period of the two kingdoms had become very disparaging, with many considering the period to be fictional. But after his work, the biblical record on the period became far more trusted. It's because of this that I am using Thiel's chronology as the basis for this video. The history of the kingdoms of Judah and Israel have served as both guidebooks and cautionary tales for the leaders of Abrahamic countries for centuries. It's a sorry tale, using the slow deaths of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah as instruments of divine retribution, the fate of hapless kings who had not kept Jehovah's law. Ancient Israel always appears like this in the records of other nations, a collection of cities struggling to survive on the crossroads of an increasingly embattled ancient East that is finally defeated and loses everything. After the death of Solomon, a civil war broke out between his successor Rehoboam and one of his ministers, Jeroboam, who led 10 northern tribes into rebellion against the monarchy, controlled by the tribe of Judah and supported by the tribe of Benjamin. Rehoboam tried to regain control of the north, but thanks to an invasion from Egypt, he wasn't able to. Throughout the histories in the Hebrew Bible, we see an emphasis on the religiosity of the kings of both Judah and Israel, and the fate of their kingdoms are tied to their following the laws of God. This tells us that the biblical sources were most likely written by members of the priestly class who would have been most concerned with proper worship practices. The northern kingdom of Israel is said to have been directed away from strict worship of Yahweh under Jeroboam, where he established rival worship sites at Dan and Bethel, which had connections with the patriarchs as well as the prophet Samuel. He is said to have revived worship of the golden calves at these sites. Throughout these histories, we see later kings embrace worship of Canaanite deities such as Baal and Moloch. Now, some would argue that this could just be Judean propaganda, but I think there is more to it than that. In previous installments of this series, I have mentioned that archaeologists have found inside of Israelite worship sites depictions and names of numerous other gods other than Yahweh. And throughout the Hebrew Bible, we see a consistent pattern of the Israelites straying away from monotheistic worship of Yahweh or engaging in other pagan practices, such as when King Saul is said to have summoned the spirit of the dead prophet Samuel. Between all the archaeological evidence and the biblical narrative constantly talking about the Israelites relapsing into idolatry over and over again, I am inclined to believe the stories of these kings pushing the worship of other deities as either being true itself or being reflective of the reality that most Israelites in both the northern and southern kingdom were not worshiping Yahweh in the means ordained by the temple priests. One of the more infamous examples of this is the reign of King Ahab, who built a temple to Baal in the northern capital of Samaria. This is said to have happened due to his marriage to a foreign princess, Jezebel, from Phoenicia. In the Bible, Baal and Moloch worship is said to have involved human sacrifice, and numerous Israelite kings are said to have sacrificed their own children to them. The Baal temples had their own priests and prophets, and they would be asked about major policy decisions, such as when King Ahab asked them if it was safe for him and King Jehoshaphat of Judah to go into battle against the king of Damascus. The Bible makes sure the readers know that this was a mistake, pointing to Ahab's death in that battle, which had been predicted by a prophet of Yahweh, Micaiah. The kings of both north and south are said to have led their people astray from temple religious practices, such as when King Jehoram of Judah married Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. Under her influence, Jehoram is said to have introduced Baal worship to Judah, had his brothers killed, and after his own death have his grandchildren killed. Luckily for the house of Judah, there was one survivor, Joash, on whose behalf Athaliah would be dethroned 7 years later. The two kingdoms had a complex foreign policy, not only with each other, but with their neighbors as well. The United Kingdom of Israel was established in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, when all the more powerful neighboring civilizations were trying to find their footing again. But as the United Monarchy fell, the neighboring powers began to reassert themselves. First there were the Egyptians coming from the south, and from the north we saw the Assyrians, and all the smaller states in the Levant had to deal with them and each other. We see numerous alliances, betrayals, subjugations, and revolts between them as they struggle for dominance. To the north we have the Phoenician states and the kingdom of Aram Damascus. To the east we have the kingdoms of Ammon and Moab. To the south we have the Edomites, and to the southwest we have the Philistines. Israel spends much of its history fighting with Aram Damascus, all the while making alliances with the Phoenicians. The kingdom of Judah fought wars with all of its neighbors, and occasionally made alliances with Israel. Many of the Judean kings are portrayed as being somewhat naive about the prospects of north and south reuniting, and you couldn't be blamed if, as a reader, you felt the same way as those kings did. There were the direct attempts at reunifying by force under Jeroboam and his immediate successors. Jehoshaphat sent missionaries into Israel in order to bring some of the northern tribes back to proper worship of Yahweh. He also had an alliance with Ahab, and despite a prophet from his own religion telling him not to go into battle, he still did, in order to pursue that elusive dream of reunification. And this dream of reunification goes badly with the marriage pact between the children of Jehoshaphat and Ahab.
This idea of unity between North and South prior to the death of Solomon is another case in which we should probably keep in mind the sources that we are using. The books of Kings and Chronicles, as well as the many books of the prophets that intersect with that history, were written by the Judean priestly class, which means not only were they more concerned with the religiosity of their subjects, but they're also coming at it from the perspective of someone from the South. Emphasizing how similar two or more groups are is a usual way of justifying why those groups should be under the same political leadership. However, the Bible is probably emphasizing the similarities between North and South more than there probably were.
There is no doubt that the two Iron Age states, Israel and Judah, had much in common. Both worshipped Yahweh among other deities. Their people shared many legends, heroes, and tales about a common ancient past. They also spoke similar languages or dialects of Hebrew, and by the 8th century BCE, both wrote in the same script. But they were also very different from each other in their demographic composition, economic potential, material culture, and relationship with their neighbors. Put simply, Israel and Judah experienced quite different histories and developed distinctive cultures.
Another important difference between the two is that of political stability. You see, the southern kingdom remained under a single dynasty until the Babylonian conquest, but the northern kingdom was facing constant assassinations and coups.
The growing instability of the northern kingdom intersected with the growing power of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, who invaded and conquered many of its neighbors. At this point, politics in both kingdoms became centered around pro- and anti-Assyrian factions. Do you try to play nice with the Assyrians, becoming tributary or vassal states, or do you resist and face obliteration? The end for the northern kingdom came with the fall of the Gadi dynasty. King Pekahiah was assassinated by one of his generals, Pekah, who proclaimed himself king. Pekah had been part of the anti-Assyrian faction and wanted to join in a greater revolt against the Assyrians. Most of the regional powers at this point, including Judah, were either tributary or vassal states. He joined an allied revolt against the Assyrians, but he would be replaced as monarch by another military leader, Hoshea. The biblical record claims that Hoshea initiated a rebellion against Pekah, while the Assyrian records claim that they had placed Hoshea on the throne after an unrelated rebellion. Either way, by this point, the kingdom of Israel had been reduced to a vassal state, consisting of little more than the city of Samaria. Late in his reign, Hoshea decided to quit paying tribute to the Assyrians. The reason why is uncertain. Either the Egyptians offered him support if he chose to revolt, or he requested aid from the Egyptians in order to revolt. Either way, Egypt was in the middle of its own civil war at this time with multiple competing dynasties, and so they were unable to assist. With this last act of defiance, the Assyrians came and crushed what was left of Israel, scattering its peoples across the empire, destroying their identities.
The kings of Judah continued the usual pattern of one king restoring proper religious practices and then one of his successors bringing back the cult of Baal. And of course, just like the north, the south also had to deal with the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and to deal with pro- and anti-Assyrian factions in the court.
Under the reign of Hezekiah, they built new fortifications around Jerusalem, and even plotted numerous rebellions against the Assyrians, but none of them ever came to pass. During a routine campaign against the Egyptians, the Assyrians decided to besiege Jerusalem, knowing of their past attempts at plotting rebellions. The Assyrian army would have captured Jerusalem, and dealt the same fate as had befallen Samaria. But the Bible describes an instance of divine intervention that caused the Assyrians to withdraw. That night, the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies.
The death toll nor any kind of defeat are mentioned in the Assyrian records, but this wouldn't be unusual for rulers at the time to exclude defeats in their official records. However, the Greek historian Herodotus offers another explanation: plague.
In his account of the Assyrian invasion of Egypt, a horde of mice enveloped the Assyrian army and chewed away at the ropes and straps of their weapons, causing them to retreat. Most historians have interpreted this as the Assyrian army being hit by some kind of plague carried on rodents. One can then assume that by the time this army reached Jerusalem on its return home, it had been hit pretty hard by the plague, and it's possible that at some point the plague casualties got a lot worse while besieging Jerusalem, causing them to retreat. Despite this victory, the kingdom of Judah was reduced to the land around the city of Jerusalem. After the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah was the last Israelite nation standing. Worship of Yahweh was preserved by the temple priests in Jerusalem, and they continued to preach the need for the children of Abraham to return to proper worship of God. However, the kings of Judah had difficulty in retaining these proper religious practices, which the Bible blames for their ultimate fall. This is what the Lord Almighty says: "Cut down the trees and build siege ramps against Jerusalem. This city must be punished. It is filled with oppression. As a well pours out its water, so she pours out her wickedness. Violence and destruction resound in her. Her sickness and wounds are ever before me. Take warning, O Jerusalem, or I will turn away from you and make your land desolate so no one can live in it." This part of the story begins with the fall of the Assyrian Empire. After the death of Ashurbanipal in 627, the Assyrian Empire fell into civil war between his sons, Ashur-etel-ilan and Sin-shar-ishkun. Shinshar had raised an army in Babylon and defeated his brother in Nineveh in 626. But that same year, a local dynasty rose up in Babylon and crowned Nabopolassar as king of Babylon. He allied with numerous enemies of the Assyrians such as the Samaritans, the Scythians, and most importantly for foreshadowing, the Medes. Many cities around the Near East wanted independence from Assyrian rule, including the rump state of Judah, which had been reduced to the land around the city of Jerusalem. The capital of Nineveh fell to the Babylonians in 611, which triggered the Egyptians into action. The Assyrian Empire had been weakening for decades, which allowed some of the larger vassal states such as Egypt to assert more control over the Levant. They preferred to deal with the weak Assyria rather than a strong Babylon. So they sent an army northward in 609 to aid the remnants of the Assyrian government, but they were halted by a small Judean army led by King Josiah, who had sided with the Babylonians. Unfortunately, the Judeans were defeated at the Battle of Megiddo, and King Josiah was killed in combat, allowing the Egyptian forces to pass through. Josiah was briefly succeeded by his son Jehoaz, but Jehoaz would be captured and taken hostage by the Egyptians, who replaced him with his brother Jehoiakim. Despite this victory against Judah, the Egyptians were defeated by the Babylonians at Carchemish in 605, and retreated back across the Sinai. As the Babylonian army under the command of the new king Nebuchadnezzar II passed through, he stopped by Jerusalem, where he won the fealty of Jehoiakim. In order to prevent the destruction of Jerusalem, Jehoiakim handed over a number of treasures from the temple to the Babylonians, along with taking a number of hostages from the royal family and Judean nobility, among them being the future prophet Daniel. Jehoiakim wasn't interested in restoring proper temple worship, for which he was criticized by the prophet Uriah, whom the king had killed. His main interest was in getting out from under the heel of Babylon, and he attempted to do so just a few years later. In 601, the Babylonians attempted a failed invasion of Egypt, which disrupted Babylonian control over the Levant. Jehoiakim re-swore allegiance to the Egyptians, but in 598 the Babylonians laid siege to the city and regained control. Jehoiakim died during the siege and was briefly succeeded by his own son, Jeconiah. After 3 months, the Babylonians replaced him with his uncle, Zedekiah. Zedekiah had the prophet Jeremiah as an advisor, who warned him to avoid the same mistakes his brother, father, and the final kings of Israel in the north had made. Do not join your idolatrous neighbors in revolts against the reigning power. But he did so anyways. He joined an alliance led by Egypt against the Babylonians. This brought the Babylonians to Jerusalem in 588 and laid siege to the city, which finally fell in 586. The city walls were torn down and the temple was destroyed, with its remaining treasures brought back to Babylon, along with the remnants of the Judean elites, including King Zedekiah and the prophet Jeremiah. Other towns and fortresses in the region were destroyed. The kingdom of Judah became the Yahudah province, with its capital relocated to Mitzpah, and one of the few remaining Judean elites, Gedaliah, being named governor. He wanted to rebuild Judah into a prosperous land by working with the Babylonians, and during his brief tenure, new farms and vineyards were planted. However, he was assassinated by Ishmael ben Nethaniah, a member of the royal house of Judah, probably as revenge for collaborating with the Babylonian occupiers. This assassination resulted in a sizable number of Jews going into exile in Egypt, despite being warned by the prophet Jeremiah not to do so, who feared leaving the promised land empty. The Babylonian captivity is a very important event for Jewish identity. Up until that point in Jewish history, being a Jew was tied to living in the Promised Land, but suddenly a large portion of them weren't, and so they had to come to grips with the covenants made by the patriarchs, and what it meant when God seemingly didn't keep his promises. Their land had been granted by Jehovah upon specific conditions. It was obviously necessary to have accurate copies of the law given to Moses. What the Babylonian exile gave to the Old Testament was a full stop, a chance to look at Israel as a single entity, a finished thing. From behind the bars of their prison, the past seemed quite a different place. Numerous books of the Bible were written or partially written during the captivity. The books of Jeremiah, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, the early chapters of Ezra, the book of Tobit, Judith, and Lamentations as well. Establishing the religious and cultural norms of the Jews was a very important part of the exile. Being surrounded by foreign gods and cultures means that you need to codify your own religion, history, and cultural practices, or else face apostasy. We should also look at some of the biblical stories taking place during the exile, many of which are found in the book of Daniel, named for one of the exiles taken into captivity. God had given Daniel great wisdom and insight, which caught the attention of Nebuchadnezzar, who brought him into his court, where he interpreted the dreams of the king. The importance of retaining your faith in the face of societal pressure is shown in the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel chapter 3, when the king had a golden idol built and demands everyone worship it, but 3 Jews refused to do so. The king had them thrown into a fiery furnace, but they were unharmed. The message being that God will be with you even in the toughest of challenges. This message is echoed again in the story of Daniel in the lion's den in chapter 6, when advisors of King Darius tricked the king into banning the worship of other gods. Daniel is arrested and thrown into the lion's den, but God protects him and he is released the next day. Another lesson taken to heart by Jews comes from the prophet Jeremiah, who had also been taken into exile. In Jeremiah 29, he writes a letter to the exiles to give them advice on what to do while kept away from their homeland. He tells them to build homes, plant gardens, and start families. He tells them to teach their children valuable skills and become useful to the Babylonians. Firstly, he's telling the Jews that this isn't going to be a short affair, and therefore they shouldn't wait for life to go back to normal before becoming productive. By learning valuable skills, they become useful to the Babylonians. Not only does this make their captors less likely to cause them harm while in exile, it also builds up useful trades for them to take back to Judah. He doesn't encourage revolt or undermining the country you're living in. His message is, be a polite guest. Being a Jew is no longer just about where you live, but about how you live. When you look at the history of the Jews and how they have typically lived and survived, this isn't just advice for the time period. This became advice for all time. The Babylonian captivity shows something amazing about the Jewish people, their ability to adapt and survive. The Jewish elites were a minority people being held in a foreign land. All the while back in their homeland, they were occupied by a much stronger foreign power. In this kind of situation, most peoples either assimilate into the population they are being held in, and eventually lose all distinctive features to the point where history forgets they ever existed, or they resist assimilation to the point of self-destruction. The lessons of Jeremiah, as well as the book of Daniel, offer a third way. You assimilate as much as necessary when it comes to unimportant things such as the way you dress or the names you give your children, but you hold firm on what's important, such as your faith. Jeremiah told the Jews to assimilate, while Daniel told them where to draw the line. The ability to do this is why there is a continuity between ancient worshippers of Yahweh and modern ones, while all the other religions from the region have died out. Nebuchadnezzar's reign was filled with conquest and construction projects, renovating at least 13 cities during his time. Unfortunately, his dynasty would not last far past himself. After his death in 562, he was succeeded by his son, Amel-Marduk, who reigned for only 2 years when a member of the Babylonian court, Nabonidus, had him assassinated. For what reason is unclear. There aren't any surviving Babylonian sources about his reign. However, there is a brief reference to him in the Hebrew Bible as Evil Merodach toward the end of 2 Kings. Also, the Greek historian Berosus referred to his reign as being illegal and impure, which could give a reasoning as to why he was assassinated. Regardless, Nerigalasser would only rule for 4 years when he was succeeded by his son Labashi-Marduk, who himself would be overthrown after 9 months. Taking power was the general Nabonidus from Haran in Old Syria. His reign was focused on religious matters, attempting to reform the Babylonian religion by centralizing it around the worship of the moon god Sin. This made him an enemy of the Babylonian priests, who centered their worship on Marduk. This enmity was made stronger when Nabonidus took greater control of the temples themselves, which had traditionally been allowed to manage their own affairs. During his reign, he began a military campaign in the Levant and went down south into Arabia, eventually settling in Taima. He spends much of his reign in Taima, ordering the restoration of temples to the god Sin, as well as converting other existing temples. His prolonged stay in Taima left his son, Belshazzar, as the de facto ruler of the empire. The biblical narrative and the historical narrative don't perfectly line up on this account. In the biblical narrative, Belshazzar is said to have been the son of Nebuchadnezzar II, and to have become king in his own right. He wasn't the son of Nebuchadnezzar, and he was never crowned king. Some historians like to make a big deal out of these inaccuracies, but I think they can be hand-waved for the most part. The Bible mostly ignores the reigns of Nerigalasser and Labashi-Marduk, and since Nabonidus spent most of his reign outside of Babylon ignoring affairs of state, it's not unreasonable to see his son and acting regent, Belshazzar, as the actual reigning king. Belshazzar's presence is mostly important for the prophecy of Babylonians' destruction in the book of Daniel. The king is holding a feast for all of his lords, and during it he has a goblet brought out that was taken from the temple in Jerusalem so that he can give a toast to the god Marduk. As the Babylonians drink, a hand appears and writes something on the wall that the Babylonians can't read. The king sends for the prophet Daniel, who could. Mene tekel upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Peres, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians.
This story is where we get the idiom writing on the wall from, a warning so obvious that God himself has spelled it out for you. The only problem, however, is that you don't recognize this warning because you don't recognize the language the warning is coming in.
In the biblical narrative, Babylon is conquered the same night by a figure called Darius the Mede, who is made king. Who exactly Darius the Mede is has been disputed. Many scholars believe he is a fictional character being used as a literary device to help fulfill a prior prophecy about the Medes. Others have tried to reconcile the biblical narrative with the historical evidence, claiming that it might be referring to a general named Gubaru, who had been the governor of Gutium under the Babylonians before switching to the Persian side. As a general, it was Gubaru who captured the city of Babylon for Cyrus, who entered a month later. Cyrus also gave Gubaru the task of governing the city after its capture. The Mede connection comes from the Babylonian sources, which associate Gutium with the Medes. The Greek historian Xenophon says he died shortly after the conquest of Babylon. Even if he was never formally a king of Babylon, I think this is the most likely answer as to who Darius the Mede was. And given other inconsistencies between the Bible and historical records, this seems to make the most sense.
Anyway, shortly after Darius the Mede may or may not have been in power, Cyrus the Great takes control of Babylon, and he reverses the religious policies of Nabonidus, returning control of temples to their respective priests and ordering the reconstruction of temples destroyed by the Babylonians.
In the first year of Cyrus the king made a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be builded, the place where they offer sacrifices, and let the foundations thereof be strongly laid. And let the expenses be given out of the king's house. And also let the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took forth out of the temple which is at Jerusalem, and brought into Babylon, be restored, and brought again unto the temple which is at Jerusalem, every one to its place. And thou shalt put them in the house of God. The Jews weren't the only people held captive. Many had been conquered and had their cities and temples destroyed, and their nobility taken to Babylon to serve the king. And after their defeat, Cyrus and the Persians won their loyalty by allowing these people to leave Babylon and return home to help the rebuilding. However, this return didn't happen all at once, but rather in successive waves led by community leaders, the first of which was led by Sheshbazzar. Sheshbazzar is another one of those biblical figures that is mentioned once and disappears after that. Sheshbazzar was named as governor of Judah or Yahudah by Cyrus and was tasked with laying the foundation for the new temple. However, he disappears from the biblical narrative after Ezra 1:11, after which a character named Zerubbabel is now the governor. Some believe that the two are the same character, and the book of Ezra we have today is actually a merging of two accounts that used a different name for the same person, which is not unprecedented in the Hebrew Bible. This is believed because Sheshbazzar is referred to as Prince of Judah in Ezra, and Zerubbabel is described as being a descendant of King David's son, Nathan. For simplicity's sake, I am going to presume they are the same person. Zerubbabel was made governor, and he traveled to Jerusalem with several thousand Jewish exiles. He was joined by Jeshua, the grandson of Sariah, the last high priest of Jerusalem before the destruction of the temple, who was named the new high priest by Cyrus. When they arrived in Jerusalem around 536, the city was desolate, and it would take a lot of work to restore the city, but when they did, they ran into trouble. The Samaritans. The Samaritans were the people who lived north of Judah in the Old Kingdom of northern Israel. After the conquest of northern Israel by the Assyrians, a large portion of the population was resettled away from their homes across the Assyrian Empire, and a new population of pagans were settled in their place. In the 200 years since, the remaining Israelite population probably intermarried with the foreign settlers and practiced a syncretic religion of Yahwism and whatever pagan religion was brought by the foreigners. If you want to know more about the Samaritans specifically, I have a video about them you can watch by clicking the eye in their upper right. When the Samaritans found out that the Jews had returned to Jerusalem and were rebuilding the temple, they wanted to assist. But the Jewish leaders wanted nothing to do with the Samaritans. We want to help you build because we worship the same God you worship. We have been sacrificing to him since the time of King Esarhaddon of Assyria, who brought us here. But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of Israel's families told them, "It isn't right for your people and our people to build the temple for our God together. We must build it alone for the Lord God of Israel, as King Cyrus of Persia ordered us to do." In response to this, the Samaritans tried to stop the Jews from rebuilding the temple by bribing officials and intimidation. They even accused the Jews of plotting a rebellion against the Persians because they wanted to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. A regional governor, Tatanai, sent a letter to King Darius asking about the temple and whether the Jews had the right to rebuild. After searching through the archives, the new king discovered that Cyrus had indeed approved not only of its construction, but also its funding. With that order made clear, the Samaritans ceased their interference and allowed the construction to continue, which was finished in 516. Much of the post-exilic stories in the Bible are about prophets rising up and telling the people of Israel to repent. The biblical stories, written by the priestly class, always emphasize proper worship and morality as the driving force of history. Since they saw the immoral and idolatrous behavior of the kings of Judah as the root cause of the fall and destruction of the temple, they needed to reinforce proper behavior. However, since Judah no longer had its own king, this means that the prophets now must solicit the people directly instead of asking the monarch to implement policies from above. They also continued the process of purifying and codifying their religion that began during the exile. One of these was monotheism. In the early parts of the Bible, there are references to other gods that treat them as though they are real, with the second commandment saying, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee a graven image, nor any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself unto them, nor serve them. For I, Jehovah thy God, am a jealous God." All this focus on worshiping other gods seems strange when you supposedly only believe in one God. While this is interpreted by some that the early Israelites weren't monotheists, but rather practiced either monolatry, that is the belief in the existence of many gods but only worshiping one, or henotheism, worshiping only one god but believing that other gods are equally real and valid. Regardless of what the Jews believed about other deities, after the exile they doubled down on what we would consider orthodox monotheism. Now, some might interpret this as the religion evolving over time. However, you could also interpret it as it was one of many views competing for dominance among them and finally won out. Another trend we begin to see emerge in Judaism at this time is Messianism, the belief in a Messiah or anointed one who will liberate the Jewish people. Numerous characters in the Hebrew Bible are anointed by God, such as King Saul, David, and Solomon. But later it takes on a new meaning. The desire for a Messiah that will save the Jewish people emerges during times of hardship and political strife. This idea first emerged in the Hebrew Bible after the fall of Jerusalem, when the Jews lost their state, but are liberated by Cyrus the Great, who the book of Isaiah names as a Messiah. "Thus saith Jehovah to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings, to open the doors before him, and the gate shall not be shut, that thou mayest know that it is I, Jehovah, who call thee by thy name, even the God of Israel." The Jews would go through other periods of Messianism after the fall of the Jewish Hasmonean kingdom, as well as after the destruction of the Second Temple, but those are stories for later episodes. Another theme that finds its way into the Hebrew Bible in the post-exilic period is the resurrection of the dead. In chapter 26 of Isaiah, we see this theme emerge. "But your dead will live, their bodies will rise. Those who live in the dust will wake up and shout for joy. For your dew is like the dew of dawn, and the earth will give birth to the dead. We see it again in Ezekiel chapter 37. The hand of the Lord was upon me. He brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and sent me down in the middle of the valley, which was full of bones. He had me pass through them and go all over among them. There were very many on the valley floor, and they were very dry. He said to me, Son of man, can these dry bones live? I answered, Lord God, you know. Then he said to me, Prophesy to these bones and say to them, Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. So I prophesied as I had been commanded, and as I was prophesying there was a noise, a rattling, as the bones came together, one bone connecting to another. As I watched, tendons were attached to them, then flesh grew over them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. So I prophesied as he commanded me. Breath entered them, and they came back to life. They stood on their feet, a very large army. And again in Daniel chapter 12. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. These ideas began to emerge within Judaism after prolonged exposure to both Babylonian religion, which many have attributed as the influence for the book of Genesis, but also after prolonged exposure to the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism, which possesses both the concept of the Messiah, known to them as the Seoshyant, and the resurrection of the dead at the end of days, known as Frashokereti. These ideas would continue to influence Jewish theological thinking beyond the pages of the Hebrew Bible and into the Talmud in the centuries after, and they would become important elements in the birth of Christianity. And so this is where the Jewish story ends as told in the Hebrew Bible, but that is not the end of the story, because in the next episode we're going to be covering the Hellenist period, along with the Maccabean revolts and the rise and fall of the Hasmonean dynasty. If you want to learn more about Jewish history, you can watch the rest of my Jewish history series in this playlist right here. Or you can also check out the channel of Sam Aronow, a history channel dedicated to Jewish history. I want to thank my patrons who help support this video. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.